Jack had been riding across the plains for days, the sun beating down on his back as he pushed his horse forward. The wind was hot and the dust seemed to cling to everything. He had no particular destination in mind. For a man like him, a cowboy who had spent most of his life alone, the endless stretch of land was both a blessing and a curse. It gave him the space he needed to think, but sometimes it was too quiet, too empty. The days dragged on, each one blending into the next. He was used to being alone, but it didn't mean he liked it. That evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, Jack decided to stop and set up camp. He found a small creek, its waters cool and refreshing. His horse, tired from the long ride, drank eagerly from the stream. Jack sat down beside the fire he had built, watching the flames dance in the breeze. The only sounds around him were the crackling of the fire and the occasional call of a bird in the distance. But then, something broke the stillness of the night. At first, Jack thought it was just the wind. He stood up, his hand instinctively reaching for the rifle slung over his shoulder. The howls he heard were unmistakable. Wolves. Jack's heart quickened as the sound grew louder, closer. He knew they were hunting, and he could tell by the sound of their growls that they had something cornered. Jack scanned the darkened landscape, his eyes sharp despite the fading light. In the distance, he spotted movement, something struggling. At first, he thought it was just an animal caught in the pack's hunt. But as the wind shifted, he realized with a jolt of shock that it was a woman. She was fighting the wolves off, swinging a long stick and yelling at the creatures. Jack's stomach tightened. She was brave, but she was also outnumbered. The pack was closing in, their eyes gleaming in the dim light, their growls becoming more menacing. There was no time to think. Jack's instincts kicked in. He grabbed his rifle and rushed forward, his heart pounding in his chest. The wolves didn't see him at first, too focused on their prey. Jack took a deep breath and fired a warning shot into the air. The wolves scattered, momentarily startled by the loud sound. Jack didn't hesitate. He ran toward the woman, ignoring the warning growls of the remaining wolves. One of the animals lunged at him, but he was faster, pulling his knife from its sheath and slashing at the animal's side. The wolf yelped and ran off into the shadows. The woman stood panting and watching him carefully, her eyes filled with a mixture of relief and suspicion. She was covered in dirt, her clothes torn, and there were scratches and bruises on her arms and legs from the wolf's attack. Jack could see the raw strength in her, but she was hurting. "Are you all right?" Jack asked, his voice calm but urgent. She didn't respond immediately, still eyeing him warily. "I'm fine," she said after a moment, her voice rough from shouting at the wolves. She took a step back, as if ready to flee at any moment. Jack stepped closer, keeping his movements slow. He didn't want to startle her. "You're hurt," he said, his eyes scanning her for signs of more serious injury. "You need help." The woman hesitated, clearly reluctant to accept assistance from a stranger. But after a few seconds, her expression softened and she nodded. "I won't run," she said, almost as if she was making a promise to herself. Jack could see the pride in her, an independent spirit that had survived on her own in this wild land. He admired her for it. He knew what it was like to depend on no one but yourself, but it was clear that tonight she needed help. "Come on," Jack said, gently guiding her to the fire. "Let me take a look at those wounds." The woman winced as she sat down, her body exhausted from the fight with the wolves. Jack got to work, carefully cleaning the cuts on her arms and legs with some water from the creek and the small first aid kit he always carried with him. He didn't say much as he worked, sensing that she wasn't in the mood for conversation. He didn't mind. He was used to silence. As he tended to her wounds, the woman watched him closely. Jack could feel her eyes on him, but he didn't mind. He had spent enough time alone that it didn't bother him. Still, he couldn't help but wonder who she was. She didn't look like someone from around here. Her clothes, though worn, had a distinct pattern, one he recognized as Apache. Her face was strong, with high cheekbones and dark eyes that seemed to see everything even in the dim light. When he finished bandaging her leg, Jack stepped back. "You're lucky," he said, his voice quiet. "Those wolves could have done a lot worse." The woman nodded but didn't say anything. She glanced over at him, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Why did you help me?" she asked, her voice low but firm. Jack shrugged, not wanting to make a big deal of it. "It's what I do. I couldn't just let them have you." The woman studied him for a long moment, then seemed to come to a decision. "You're different from most," she said, her voice still filled with wariness but also a hint of something else. Perhaps gratitude, or maybe curiosity. Most would have left me. Jack felt a pang of guilt. He knew that in this land, survival often meant turning your back on others, especially strangers. But something in him couldn't do that, not tonight. I couldn't, he said simply. I'm Jack, by the way. Maya, the woman replied. Thank you. Jack gave a small nod, though he wasn't sure how much thanks he deserved. He had only done what any man would have done. But he could see that Maya was different, stronger than most women he had met. She had fought off the wolves, and even though she was injured, she had kept her composure. Jack was impressed more than he cared to admit. As the night wore on, the two sat by the fire, neither of them speaking much. The warmth of the flames seemed to make the air between them more comfortable, and slowly Jack felt the tension in his chest ease. He had been alone for so long that the presence of another person, even a stranger, was a welcome change. Maya, for her part, seemed to settle into the silence, though her gaze never strayed far from Jack. As the fire burned down to embers, Jack stood up. I'll keep watch tonight, he said, his eyes scanning the darkness around them. Maya gave him a nod of thanks, her hand resting on the hilt of the knife at her side. She didn't need. The morning light broke through the trees, casting long shadows across the campsite. Jack was already awake, as he always was. He had spent years waking up before the sun, getting ready for whatever the day would throw at him. His horse, now well rested, was grazing nearby, and the small fire from the night before had burned down to a few glowing embers. Maya was still asleep, wrapped in the blanket Jack had given her to keep warm. He had always preferred the quiet of the early morning, but today there was something different about the stillness. The night had changed things between him and Maya. Something unspoken lingered in the air, and he couldn't help but wonder where this journey was headed. He moved quietly around the camp, making breakfast for both of them. It wasn't much, just some hard biscuits and beans, but it would do. He knew Maya wasn't accustomed to the food of a cowboy, but after everything that had happened, he figured she might not mind. After a while, Maya stirred and sat up, wiping sleep from her eyes. She glanced around, taking in the sights of the quiet campsite, and her gaze landed on Jack, who was busy tending to the fire. She didn't say anything at first, just watched him with a guarded look as though still trying to figure him out. She wasn't used to letting people get close, especially strangers. Her life had taught her to be cautious, but something about Jack made her feel strangely at ease. Morning, Jack said, giving her a small smile. His voice was deep and calm, the kind of voice that matched his rugged appearance. Morning, Maya replied, though her voice still held a note of caution. She wasn't quite ready to relax completely, but after the events of the previous day, she was beginning to trust him more. Jack handed her a plate of food. Eat up. We've got a long day ahead of us. Maya took the plate, though she didn't dive into it right away. Her thoughts were still scattered, and she wasn't used to sitting down and enjoying a meal. She had spent most of her life running, surviving by whatever means necessary. But as she sat there looking at the man who had saved her life, she couldn't help but wonder what kind of life this cowboy led. Why had he helped her? Why hadn't he just left her to fend for herself like so many others would have? Jack sat down next to her, his eyes focused on the horizon. So Maya, what brings you out here? He had been wondering the same thing since he first laid eyes on her. But now that she was awake, he figured it was time to ask. Maya hesitated, her eyes darkening as though the question brought back painful memories. She shifted uncomfortably before responding. I'm on my own. Always have been. My tribe. She trailed off, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack didn't press her for more, sensing that she wasn't ready to share everything just yet. He understood that. He had his own secrets, things he didn't share with anyone. They were both just two people trying to survive in a harsh world. You don't have to tell me if you don't want to, Jack said, his voice soft. But I'm here if you ever do. Maya nodded, grateful for the kindness in his words. It was rare but not unheard of. She had met others in her life who had shown kindness, but she had always been taught to be wary of it. Life had taught her to trust only herself and her tribe. But this cowboy, Jack, he was different. There was something about him that made her believe she could let her guard down just a little. The two of them spent the morning packing up the camp. Jack moved with quiet efficiency, taking care to make sure everything was in its place. Maya, though still recovering from her encounter with the wolves, helped where she could. She wasn't one to sit idly by, and Jack appreciated that. Once everything was packed, they both mounted their horses, ready to continue their journey. Jack led the way, his eyes scanning the terrain for any signs of danger while Maya followed closely behind. The silence between them was comfortable now, and though neither spoke much, there was a growing sense of companionship between them. As the day wore on, the landscape began to change. The dry plains gave way to more rugged terrain, with rolling hills and patches of sparse trees. Jack noticed Maya's movements becoming slower, and he could tell she was still feeling the effects of the wolf attack. He slowed his horse to match her pace. "You doing all right?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. Maya nodded, though she didn't look at him. "I'll be fine. I'm used to pain." Jack frowned, but he didn't push the issue. He could tell that Maya wasn't one to ask for help, no matter how much she needed it. He respected that, even if it meant she pushed herself too hard at times. The two of them rode in silence for a while longer, until the sun began to set. Jack suggested they set up camp again, this time near a small stream. The air was cooler now, and the promise of a warm fire was enough to ease the tiredness in both of them. As the night settled in, Jack went about starting the fire while Maya gathered some dry wood. She moved with the same grace and strength that had impressed him from the start. He had never met a woman like her, someone who could stand her ground in the face of danger and still carry herself with such dignity. When the fire was lit, they sat down across from each other, the warmth of the flames flickering between them. Jack didn't know what to say next. He had gotten used to being alone, to the quiet of his own thoughts, but tonight, the silence felt different. It wasn't uncomfortable, it was just new. Maya stared into the fire, her face softening in the glow. She seemed lost in thought, and Jack didn't interrupt her. Instead, he watched her, admiring the strength in her. It was clear she had been through a lot in her life, but she wore it well. There was a toughness in her that Jack couldn't quite explain, but it was something he respected. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of silence, Maya spoke. "You know, Jack, you're different from most men I've met." Jack raised an eyebrow. "How's that?" She turned her gaze to him, her eyes steady and direct. "You didn't run when things got tough. You stayed. Most would have left me to die out there." Jack felt a lump form in his throat. He wasn't used to hearing words like that. He had never thought of himself as